Alla Efimova,
And I am Terri Cohn.
and welcome to the second episode of the video blog where we talk with artists, scholars, and curators about Sonya Rapoport's magnum opus, Objects on My Dresser, a fascinating yet little understood work. Between 1979 and 1983, Rapoport collaborated with a psychiatric social worker on analyzing and interpreting the personal significance of 28 objects accumulated on her tansu, a bedroom dresser. The complex web of associations between the objects, souvenirs, trinkets, personal photos, and images and words developed into a web of meanings that Rapoport externalized into a kind of self-portrait during the time when she was mourning her mother's death. Objects on My Dresser unfolded over 4 years in what Rapoport called 11 phases or iterations, which we have now researched and documented for an upcoming book. More about the entire project, as well as previous episodes of the video blog, can be found on the Sonya Rapoport Legacy Trust website. Today, we're so pleased to speak with Meredith Tromble about phase 10 of Objects of My Dresser, called the Periodic Table of Elements. Created in 1979, it is a collage on a standard wall-size periodic table that we're also familiar with from our chemistry classroom days. Meredith is just the right person to speak to about this work. She's an artist and writer with her feet planted in both art and science. She has been an artist in residence at the Complexity Sciences Center at UC Davis since 2011. She's the co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Biology in Art and Architecture, as well as the Bloomsbury book series, Biotechne, Interthinking Art, Science, and Design. She is a professor of interdisciplinary studies and art and technology at the San Francisco Art Institute.
Welcome, Meredith.
I'm
Let's
so happy to be here.
Yay. Let's first describe the work we're talking about. Each chemical element square contains collaged images of one of the 28 objects on Rapoport's dresser, matched by their names and personal associations. For instance, she collaged the object she called Mother's ceramic cat onto the square dedicated to cerium, a chemical element named after the dwarf planet Ceres. The planet was, in turn, named after the goddess of motherly love. In this way, Rapoport created a system of matter, names, and symbols to represent her personal psychological state. In a sense, she overlaid this map of her psyche onto another, psyche over science. The periodic table of elements represents Rapoport's turn toward using a grid structure for her work, in this case, the scientific table. It can be considered a surrogate for her dresser, with spaces to hold images of the objects within various element squares. It also offered her the chance to extend her interest in image, object, word associations, a strategy that Rapoport continued to explore through the rest of her career. In 1997, more than a decade after Objects on My Dresser was completed, the periodic table of elements appeared on the cover of Leonardo, the art and science magazine established in 1968 in Paris by Frank Molina. Rapoport's association with Leonardo was deep and long. Meredith, can you talk about Leonardo, the art and science movement, and sort of the arts community that evolved around the journal? We're curious, how did Sonya fit in?
Well, I should say that in terms of Sonia's entry into this community, would have only known of this through legendary stories. So I met her, I did meet her in the 1980s, I think, but I really got to know her when we were both on the board of Leonardo later on. But I know from my studies of art and technology history that in the late 20th century, I mean, Leonardo was the place. It was almost the only place for artists who were interested in exploring science and technology. Edward Schenken, the art historian, has written about the wedge that was just driven between conceptual art and new media art by the Vietnam War. And I think from today's point of view, where pretty much all art is touched by digital technology somewhere in its lifetime, it's really hard to miss how completely new media artists were shunned by the art world in the 1970s. But there was this publication started by a scientist artist called Leonardo, which was interested in what they were doing, which would publish their ideas, which in itself was an interesting example of taking something from both worlds. I mean, the idea of a journal in which you reported your results or your work is a little different than the art world idea of a journal, which is a distance critique of the philosophy of the work, essentially. So Sonya was, I think in many, as I understand it, she was in many ways operating within a social universe that was filled with scientists and artist friends, but was not necessarily, it was more centered around the University of California, Berkeley, where her husband was on the faculty, rather than any of the kind of sub art worlds around the Bay Area. But she was very active in Leonardo. She was a linchpin and helped the organization keep going for decades when it was very difficult. So she deserves a lot of credit for that.
I want to ask you more about the way in which Sonya turned to scientific symbols and structures, especially in this project, An Object on My Dresser, in relation to the psychoanalytic or therapeutic process that she was undergoing. What can you say about this association or this sort of web that she was spinning between objects, images, words, and in this case, symbols, particularly scientific symbols from chemistry?
Yeah. So I did a lot of, I've thought a lot about this actually, in terms of the symbols in Sonya's work. And my thinking at the moment is that the scientific symbols are really no different than the religious symbols, which she also used quite prolifically. And the items from the objects on my dresser, one could think of like through the sheer weight and pressure of her involvement with them over time, her continued objects with the, her continued engagement with these humble objects. It was almost as though she were turning them into symbols as well, just through the, like you would put pressure on carbon to make it a diamond or something. She was imbuing these somewhat, perhaps to other people, meaningless objects with symbol power, infusing them. And so I see the scientific symbols as playing a role which is much more about the possibility of doing that, of taking a letter like C, say, and making it mean something through the scientific process. She was also very interested in the mythologies and stories that had adhered to elements like gold, for example, where there's just a wealth of stories that go along with them, as you told when you talked about the cerium. But I don't actually see this, it seems to me that her work was not really about those things as much as they just added to the weight of this idea that this item has or can have a deep significance in the world, and the process of imbuing it with that significance.
So maybe I'll ask them the related question. In your essay that you published in Pairing of Polarities, the book that Terri edited in 2012, you call the objects talismanic. What do you mean by that? And is it related to what you were just trying to explain?
I think it is. I think it is related. The idea of a talisman is something, an object usually whose presence impacts your psyche. It through some kind of process, a religious process, could be a scientific process, perhaps, or it's some personal history. That object has come to have meanings which are going to interact with your chemistry. You know, when you see it, you're going to feel safer, or you're going to feel more powerful, or it has some kind of internal effect.
If we go back to 1980, which is when she was devising the conceptual scaffold for objects on my dresser, she began this daily practice she did during all of 1980 of creating a pictorial diary using an oversized wall calendar as a matrix. And each calendar cell became a container for a small collage of pasted words or images that recorded her thoughts and feelings and her experiences on that date. This new archive of images and text became the foundation of her piece called Biorhythm, which she worked on simultaneously with completing Object on My Dresser in 1983. Perhaps you could talk a little more about the significance of the grid for Sonya in her work, as well as, you know, in these other, the calendars and the computer printouts. You can sort of take this where you want.
So the similarity between the periodic table and the calendar in their grid form is significant, but I think it's also I think it's also important that grids were kind of in the air when she started this work. I mean, the conceptual and minimal work coming out of New York was very influential in the art world. Think Sol LeWitt. When he would use the grid, it drains the feeling or any potential feeling from the set of relationships. I mean, he said that his use of the grid is, quote, just a way I think, making a kind of order where everything is equal, nothing is superior, and nothing is inferior. So, but Rapoport's use of grids is really different from that. The use that LeWitt made of the grid suppressed any kind of preference or desire or set of values in these relationships that he's proposing. It's very cool. And Rapoport's use of the grid is not the opposite of that cool approach, because I think her work is also very cool, actually, to me at least. But it is at a decided tangent from that. She's not starting with a set of abstract mathematical relationships like LeWitt, but with really highly charged personal and human relationships. And so that sets up a different situation. Her grid may also be suppressing to any particular communication to you about what's most important to her, whether she prefers one thing or the other, or what it means to her personally. But because these are personal objects, it keeps this immense tension between the cool suppression of the feeling and the desire and the values and what it meant, and this personal material, which seems like it keeps trying to push up, but you can never quite see it. And so that is that's a use of the grid, which is really hers and distinctive in her, a distinctive way that she connected with something that was a huge concern in the art world at that time.
Are there things that we haven't discussed that you would like to bring up?
You
and
know,
reflect on?
since you're giving me the opportunity, I just want to talk about how great she was. I have here, this is a lab coat that belonged to her husband, Henry, who was a very well-respected chemist. And at some point in the early 2000s, I was making a performance and an exhibition with a group of my students. And Sonya not only contributed work to the exhibition so that the students got to interact and have an opening with such, a wonderfully established and prolific artist. She loaned me this lab coat for the performance, and then when she saw that as things developed, she said, "You know what? I'm ready to let go of it. Why don't you just keep it?" And so I have treasured it for now 2 decades and will continue to treasure it.
Well, Meredith, we always enjoy talking with you and really appreciate your time and your insights. And we hope you continue to thrive despite these challenging times.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful talking with you.